I remember the sound before anything else, the faint echo of a choir rehearsal leaking through the closed doors of St. Simeon's Chapel. I had no reason to be there that morning, other than the inexplicable pull of music drifting through fog. A hymn, fractured by stone acoustics, a voice fractionally sharp on the final note. It unsettled me in ways I couldn't quite explain. Oxford has always carried sound differently. It lingers, like guilt, refusing to fade. I'd been walking aimlessly after a tiresome meeting at HQ. Strange had made another of his cheerful pronouncements about taking a few days off. I nodded, of course, and then did precisely the opposite. My feet brought me here, as they often did when I wanted to think and not think at once. The frost on the lawns was thin as tissue paper. A bell tolled, distant and imperfectly timed. I remember thinking that imperfection was sometimes more beautiful than precision, a sentiment I regretted when I saw the headline that afternoon. Former choir director found dead in apparent fall. The photograph beneath the line showed Adrien Lascelles, once a rising name in the cloistered world of sacred music, later a forgotten man. His eyes looked away from the camera, towards something unseen, as though already rehearsing his departure. I folded the paper neatly, poured myself a measure of Glenfiddich, and tried not to care. But some silences invite curiosity more effectively than words. It was the following morning that Lewis mentioned the case offhand, almost apologetic. Routine inquiry, he called it. Lascelles had fallen down the chapel stairs after locking up for the night. Tragic, but ordinary. Yet the word ordinary always provokes suspicion in me. Oxford has never done anything ordinarily. Death, least of all. When we reached St. Simeon's, the air smelled of polish and damp stone. A faint trace of candle wax lingered near the altar, though no candles burned. Lewis busied himself with the constable's report, while I stood at the foot of the stairs. They were narrow, spiraling, treacherous even in daylight. At the bottom, the blood had already been cleaned, or nearly so, but I noticed a darker line running along the flagstones, as though someone had wiped in haste. Not incompetence, exactly more the kind of cleaning that comes from fear. The dean received us with the solemn efficiency of a man balancing grief and administration. He said all the things one says at such times the college mourns. The service will be arranged. The chapel will remain closed until further notice. He did not say that he disliked Lascelles, though the sentiment hovered in the pauses between his words. I asked about the dead man's work, his papers, and his music. The dean smiled thinly and said there was little of importance left. A pity, I replied, since music is often the only confession a man leaves behind. I found the choir master's office untouched. A faint draught stirred a sheaf of manuscripts on the desk. One of them caught my eye, a half-finished score titled Canticle for the Departed. The notes ran confidently across the page until the final line, where they simply stopped. No correction, no smudge, only the faint indentation of a quill that had hesitated, as if waiting for permission to end. It was then that I felt the same subtle dissonance I'd heard through the chapel doors the morning before, a note that never resolved. Lewis asked whether I thought it was suicide. I said I didn't know, though in truth I did. The human hand that breaks symmetry tends to reveal itself through small mistakes. The spectacles found near the altar were intact, one arm folded, one extended. A man who falls breaks the frame or loses it altogether. A man who stages a scene remembers how the body should appear, but forgets the glasses. Outside, dusk pressed itself against the cloisters. The choir boys were dismissed early. Their laughter echoed briefly before fading into the quadrangle. I stood a moment longer beneath the chapel archway, listening to the last vibrations of their voices. Somewhere beyond, a single pigeon fluttered up toward the bell tower, disturbed by something unseen. There are deaths that close a chapter and deaths that open one. I suspected even then that Adrien Lascelles had done the latter. The tune I had heard that morning, that imperfect note, still lingered in my mind, insistent as conscience. It was not the sound of a choir rehearsing. It was a farewell, unfinished. There is something peculiarly chilling about entering a college when it grieves. The architecture itself seems to retreat, narrowing, light dimming, echoes pausing just a moment too long before returning. St. Simeon's had that hush when Louis and I arrived the next morning. The porter, a man who wore his respectability like a starched collar, had already prepared a key to the chapel. He looked relieved to hand it over as though it carried contagion. The air inside was faintly medicinal polish, dust, and that soft sweetness of candle grease left too long unlit. The choir stalls stood empty. A few hymnals lay open, spine cracked, as though the singers had departed mid-service. The stained glass, muted by drizzle, scattered pale fragments of color over the floor. I remember Louis saying something about how peaceful it seemed. I remember thinking peace was often an after-effect of thorough cleaning. At the foot of the stairs where Lascelles had fallen, the flagstones bore a faint discoloration, darker than the rest. The constable's photographs showed the body lying at an angle inconsistent with the curvature of the steps. I didn't say so aloud. Some things are best thought of twice before spoken. Instead, I walked the distance myself from the vestry door to the bottom step and imagined the last few seconds of descent. It was not easy to believe in an accident. Lascelles had been a cautious man by all accounts, and the banister smooth enough to steady a drunk. Louis, meanwhile, was engaged in his own quiet archaeology, noting footprints, candle drippings, a discarded handkerchief. His attention, as ever, was practical. Mine was otherwise. I found myself studying the organ loft. Dust lay unevenly across the railing, and there, amid the film of grey, the faint imprint of a hand. Not freshly made, but recent enough to remember heat. The dean met us in his rooms shortly after. Polite condolences, professional regret. He was a tall man with a scholar's stoop and a voice trained to echo in vaulted spaces. His words were measured, chosen as one might select stones to build a wall. The college, he said, was saddened but not surprised. Lascelles had been unwell, erratic, withdrawn. There had been whispers, of course, but one ignores such things in a place that values silence. I asked whether the whispers involved the choir. His eyes shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward a portrait of some long-dead warden. He spoke of artistic temperament, of burdensome talent, of the loneliness peculiar to genius. I let him talk until he contradicted himself, first claiming he and Lascelles had not spoken in months, then recalling a conversation only a few nights before. I said nothing. People often betray the truth not through what they confess, but what they try to arrange neatly. When we left, Louis muttered about university politics, about the unspoken currency of prestige. I told him prestige had killed more men than malice ever could. He said he didn't quite follow. I told him that was precisely the problem. Back in the chapel, a sound reached us from the vestry of the choir rehearsing under their interim organist. The music rose in cautious unison, the voices disciplined, the phrasing impeccable. Yet something was missing. The upper notes carried a hesitation, as though the singers were aware of absence. One of the boys faltered on a high A, and the organist hissed the correction under his breath. I watched him, a thin, anxious man in his 40s with a habit of blinking twice before speaking. His name, the porter later told us, was Dr. Vaughan. Vaughan explained that Lascelles had been preparing the choir for a commemorative service, a special performance of one of his own compositions, but the manuscript, he said, had gone missing. He assumed the police had taken it. We had not. The man's eyes flickered briefly toward the organ loft when I mentioned the fall. Guilt? Fear? Or merely habit, the trained movement of someone used to watching heights? before leaving, so I walked once more to the altar. There, beside the brass candlestick, a small flake of glass caught the light from a broken spectacle's lens, invisible to all but the compulsively curious. I turned it between my fingers, the faint smear of something red-brown along one edge. Blood, perhaps, or polish, or something far more ordinary, which in Oxford is precisely what one learns never to trust. That evening, as I sat at home with a crossword and a tumbler of whiskey, one clue refused to resolve itself. Invisible harmony of souls departed, 5,1. It took me several minutes and another measure of patience to see it. Choir invisible. The phrase sat there on the page like a quiet admonition. I looked up at the rain pressing against the window and thought of the chapel, the faint handprint, the missing music. The living always perform for the dead, I remember thinking, and sometimes the dead demand an encore. It was raining again, that half-hearted Oxford rain which neither drenches nor relents, only insinuates itself into stone, the kind of weather that seeps through your coat and thoughts alike. I remember standing beneath the chapel archway, listening to the drip of water from the gargoyles, and wondering why every melody in this place ended in a minor key. Lewis, good soul, had fetched the files from the coroner's office. A tidy report, unimpeachable in its completeness, and therefore I distrusted it. Death by misadventure causes blunt force trauma to the skull. No evidence of struggle. Yet there was something in the phrasing, no evidence, that invited contradiction. The absence of evidence is not its opposite. It is its echo. Inside, the choir rehearsed under their new conductor. The sound floated, reverent but uncertain. I stood near the back, eyes adjusting to the dimness, and watched the young tenor Simon Calder, Lewis whisper, fumble a bar, recover, then glanced toward the organist for approval he did not receive. The music stumbled again, this time on a different note. Once might have been nerves. Twice was guilt. After rehearsal, I caught Calder leaving by the side aisle. He startled when I spoke his name, the way people do when they think themselves unseen. I asked how long he had known Lascelles. "Since the term began," he said. "A scholarship boy." He added that Lascelles had promised to recommend him for a competition in Vienna, his voice half pride, half sorrow. But when I asked what time he'd last seen the choir master, the notes of his answer jarred. He claimed to have been in the music room that night, composing. The room was found locked from the outside, a small discord, easily overlooked unless one is cursed with an air for them. Lewis and I lunched later in the King's Arms, though neither of us cared much for food. He read from the biography and progress we'd borrowed from Rachel Denning, Adrian Lascelles. A study in sacred contradictions. She'd written that Lascelles believed in music as atonement for what the church could not forgive. I underlined that line in my mind. People who believe too much in redemption are usually hiding something irredeemable. In the afternoon, we met Denning herself in the library reading room. She was younger than I expected, composed in that careful academic way that conceals intensity. Her hands were ink-stained, her voice, melodic yet weary. She spoke of Lascelles' genius, his obsession with purity of tone, his temper, his solitude. She had come to Oxford to finish his biography, she said, but confessed she had once studied under him long ago. The admission hung between us like incense smoke. I asked about a missing manuscript canticle for the departed. She hesitated, then said it was never finished, that he had abandoned it years ago, yet a page of it had been found on his desk the night he died. That evening I examined that very page again under the lamplight. Ink faded, paper coarse, but the notation was precise, almost mathematical. The final bar ended abruptly, as if interrupted mid-thought. In the margin, a faint pencil scrawl, Dies illa, that day. The words stirred something half-remembered. A choral work by Verdi, a line from the Requiem Mass, the Day of Wrath. the piece Lascelles had chosen for the next performance. Coincidence, perhaps, but in my experience, coincidences are the laziest lies. Later, at home, I worked through a crossword habit, not diversion. One clue read disharmony among Saint Seven. The answer came, reluctantly, discord. I thought of the choir's fragile unison, the dean's calm evasions, the stain on the flagstones that cleaning could not erase. There was a pattern forming, faint but inevitable, like a melody played beneath the surface of another. Before bed, I poured myself another whiskey and opened the window. From across the city came the muffled toll of Magdalen's bells, solemn and slow, a harmony of ghosts. I wondered, as I often did, how many of Oxford's deaths began as accidents and ended as arrangements. The next morning, I returned to the chapel before sunrise. The candles had been relit. Someone had been there after hours. On the organ stand, a glass half filled with communion wine, a lipstick mark faint against the rim, a feminine trace in a masculine space. I touched it, felt the coolness still clinging to it, and then, softly, beneath the organ pipes, I heard it again, the same dissonant interval from before. A note stretched too far, yearning for resolution. Discord in E minor. A mistake, perhaps, or a message. I remember thinking how strange it was that music could conceal both confession and crime in the same breath. There are men whose politeness feels like a wall. The Dean of St. Simeon's was one of them, a man of perfect diction and architectural calm. Each word he spoke seemed constructed to prevent the possibility of intimacy. When Lewis and I arrived in his room that morning, the first thing I noticed was the smell of beeswax and pipe ash. The second was the way his books were arranged not alphabetically, nor by subject, but by height. It told me everything I needed to know about his preference for appearance over truth. He greeted us as though we had interrupted a particularly fine sentence. His condolences on the tragedy were offered without conviction, his sorrow carefully measured. He insisted Lascelles had been a complicated but essentially good man, which in Oxford usually translates to the opposite. When I asked when he had last seen the choir master, he hesitated, then said he could not recall exactly. I said memory was often selective when convenience required it. He smiled at that, but not kindly. The dean poured coffee into cups thin enough to betray every tremor. He asked if the police believed the death accidental. I told him my belief was not our department. Fact, I said, is often what survives interrogation. His eyes flickered briefly toward the portrait above the mantel, a painted likeness of a younger version of himself, robed and idealized. I have seen guilt in many forms, but rarely so well tailored. Lewis, ever the diplomat, steered the talk toward the college's finances. The dean spoke of endowments, scholarships, and the difficulty of maintaining excellence in lean times. His voice carried the faint weariness of someone who has been explaining the cost of virtue to the uninitiated. But when the matter of the choir's restoration fund arose, there was a pause too long to be accidental. He said Lascelles had been uncomfortable with certain administrative decisions. The word was soft enough to conceal a wound. Afterwards, he excused himself to retrieve a ledger from his study. When the door closed behind him, I moved toward the writing desk by the window. There, beneath a stack of correspondence, lay an envelope unsealed, unaddressed, but distinctly personal. Inside, a single sheet of vellum bearing a Latin phrase written in careful hand, ut veritas latet, concordia floreat. Let truth lie hidden, that harmony may flourish. A college motto, perhaps, or a confession dressed as wisdom. When the dean returned, I asked about it. He looked directly at me, then said he'd forgotten it was there. I told him that forgetting and hiding were not the same art. For the first time, he seemed uncertain which role he was playing, mourner, administrator, or gatekeeper. We left soon after. Outside, Lewis remarked that I'd been rather sharp with him. I told him sharpness was sometimes the only way to draw blood from a stone. He looked at me as though unsure whether I was joking. I wasn't. That afternoon, I sat in the chapel, alone. The light was dying through the stained glass, and for a moment the colors on the floor seemed to pulse like veins. The organ pipes loomed above, silent and tall as judges. I took out the small hymn book I'd borrowed from the vestry and noticed a page out of place, newer, whiter, slightly slicker to the touch. A photocopy inserted among yellowed leaves. The hymn was Dies Illa, the same one from Lascelles' unfinished score. Yet in the Latin text, a single word differed from every edition I had ever seen. Where it should have read Beati the Blessed, it read Damnati, the damned. It was no misprint. The letter forms were deliberate, too precise to be error. Someone had replaced that page intentionally. The choice of word, the inversion of meaning, was almost liturgical in its cruelty. As I sat there, the college bell began its evening toll. 6 slow strikes, each one fading before the next began. I thought of Lascelles, hearing those same chimes on his last night, each toll another step down the dark spiral of the chapel stairs. Back at my flat, later, I found myself filling in the crossword I'd left unfinished that morning. The clue read, Virtue concealed beneath false harmony. 5. The answer came to me easily, Dean. I stared at it for a long time, then crossed it out. There are truths that come too soon and others that never come at all. It was the sort of morning Oxford reserves for the undeserving, cold, immaculate, and unforgiving. The rain had retreated, leaving behind pavements that glistened like oiled slate, and the scent of damp paper rising from the Bodleian's walls. I remember thinking that the city looked scrubbed clean of deceit, which in itself was deceit enough. Lewis had been at the college since dawn, speaking with the choir boys. Their recollections were predictably rehearsed fragments of anxiety polished into obedience. I found him in the cloister with a notebook full of contradictions. One claimed to have seen a light in the chapel long after curfew. Another swore Lascelles had dismissed them early. None mentioned the hymn books. I took one of the volumes from the vestry shelf myself. Most were identical, bound in burgundy, pages dog-eared from decades of adolescent piety. But one slimmer, newer one stood out. On its flyleaf was written the name Simon Calder. The handwriting had the affected neatness of youth, and yet beneath it, faintly visible in pencil, another name had been erased, E. Reeve. I had no reason then to recall the name, though later it would return to me like a melody heard before sleep. Lewis joined me, frowning at the silence. He said the choir master's office still smelled of turpentine, perhaps. But he'd noticed a torn scrap of paper lodged beneath the carpet edge near the piano. I unfolded it. Music notation, a few measures only, but unmistakably in Lascelles' hand. The bars ended abruptly, the final note unresolved. The same hesitation I'd seen before, the same arrested cadence. It was titled Carmen Damnatorum. I translated the Song of the Damned softly. Lewis looked at me as though I'd spoken a curse. I told him it was probably an early draft. He asked whether that meant anything. I said everything worth knowing is written between drafts. We interviewed Calder that afternoon in the refectory. He sat upright, hands clasped tightly, eyes avoiding ours. He told us Lascelles had been mentoring him for a scholarship. They'd argued the week before about nothing serious. He insisted merely artistic differences. He spoke of the man's brilliance, his temper, his loneliness. Then, with the nervous impulse of confession, he added that Lascelles had promised to include one of his verses in a new choral piece. When I asked which, he hesitated. He couldn't remember the title, he said, only that it was something about redemption. Afterwards, I watched him leave through the quadrangle. His gait was too quick, too deliberate. There's a kind of walking peculiar to guilt, not haste, but rehearsal. In the evening, the dean hosted a small memorial gathering. Polite grief poured like weak sherry. I stood apart, near the window, listening to the rain return in soft percussion against the glass. Rachel Denning appeared beside me. She wore black without affectation, and her eyes, which had been steady the day before, now seemed older. She said she'd found something, a notebook Lascelles kept locked in his bureau. Inside were translations of Latin hymns, each accompanied by annotations. Most were routine. But one, the page for Dies Illa, contained a margin note in his hand, rewriting Simon's part. I asked her what that meant. She said she didn't know. Then, after a pause, added that she'd once known Simon long ago as a chorister from her brother's time. Her brother, she said, had taken his own life after a scandal no one spoke of. His name was Edward Reeve. Later, walking alone through Radcliffe Square, I considered the symmetry of things. 2 names erased, 2 melodies unfinished, 2 verses missing. Oxford loves its patterns almost as much as it loves its silences. Somewhere amid those repetitions, the truth had hidden itself like a discord folded into harmony. Back in my room, I poured a drink and spread the fragments across my desk. The torn sheet of music, the altered hymn book, and the note about Simon. The pattern began to breathe faintly, though not enough to reveal itself. My crossword lay unfinished beside them. One clue stared back at me. What the choir lost, the damned reclaimed 7. For once I couldn't find the answer. I left it blank. Some mysteries, I reminded myself, prefer the company of their own silence. There are years that never quite leave Oxford. 1974 was one of them. It lingered in corners like the smell of old varnish, in whispered references to events that no one quite dared to name. Every college has its ghost year, the one that changed things quietly, irreversibly. For St. Simeon's, it was the year a young chorister named Edward Reeve was found dead by the river, and Adrian Lascelles resigned his post 2 weeks later. It was Rachel Denning who gave the date substance. She arrived at the police station unannounced, holding a manila folder pressed tightly to her chest, as though it contained something fragile enough to break under guilt. She said she'd been dishonest, that she'd known Lascelles longer than she'd claimed. I offered her tea, which she didn't drink, and silence, which she did. She began to talk haltingly at first, then with the measured fluency of someone who has rehearsed confession many times and never quite delivered it. Edward Reeve, she said, had been her brother, a chorister under Lascelles' direction. There had been talk of impropriety, of disciplinary proceedings, of a note the boy left behind. The college buried it all with remarkable efficiency. Lascelles left Oxford and resurfaced a decade later, teaching music at a girls' school in Lincolnshire. Lewis sat quietly, pen hovering over his notebook. I could tell he wanted to ask whether the rumors were true, but some questions curdled once voiced. Instead, I asked about the note. Rachel said she'd never seen it, that her family had been told it contained nothing of consequence, only lines from a Latin hymn. Pace mihi, Domine, spare me, O Lord. After she left, I walked to the college archives. The custodian, a retired don whose memory functioned like a filing cabinet, produced the 1974 term reports with ceremonial reluctance. There it was. Reeve, Edward, deceased. Incident classified as accidental drowning. No mention of the note, no disciplinary record, no correspondence. Yet between 2 consecutive pages, a thin imprint of erased handwriting pressure marks, faint as breath. I held the sheet to the window light and read fragments of what had once been written beneath. Forgive him. He meant well. Tell R.D. I felt an old unease stir. Forgive whom? Tell whom? The initials could only have belonged to Rachel Denning. Back in the present, the dean insisted there were no surviving records of that year's choir. Lost during renovations, he said, though the college buildings themselves seemed more intact than ever. His voice held the faintest irritation, the tone of a man asked to exhume what he had spent decades burying. I thanked him and left, though not before noticing a framed photograph on his wall of the 1974 choir, arranged in neat rows beneath the chapel arch. At the center, a thin, solemn boy with an unreadable expression, Edward Reeve. Behind him, the dean, younger, smiling faintly, and Lascelles, half-turned, eyes averted. Later, in my flat, I spread the photograph beside the torn manuscript. The notation in Carmen Damnatorum contained an unusual chord structure, one that repeated twice in reverse, a mirrored progression. It reminded me of something I couldn't place. Then, slowly, I heard it. The college choir's current hymn, the one they had been rehearsing all week, shared the same interval pattern. Someone had resurrected it without realizing where it came from. Lewis called that evening. Forensics had found traces of varnish on the broken spectacles. "Organ varnish," he said, "the kind used on wooden pipes," which meant Lascelles hadn't fallen near the stairs at all, but by the organ loft. Moved after death, staged for piety's sake. I poured another measure of whiskey and stared at the photo again. The symmetry of it all unnerved me. The mirrored chords, the erased name, the rewritten hymns. History repeating itself not as tragedy or farce, but as unfinished refrain. Outside, the bells began their quarter-hour chime. I remembered something Lascelles had once written in a concert program. Every note, once sounded, continues forever in the memory of air. Perhaps he'd been right. Perhaps Oxford still carried the echoes of 1974, just faint enough to be mistaken for a silence. Some objects resist explanation because they were never meant to be found. The glass on the organ was one of them. I remember how the morning light caught the rim, making it shimmer faintly, as though it belonged to another century. A small thing, half filled with communion wine, set neatly where no service had taken place. Lewis had dismissed it at first as a remnant from practice, perhaps. But in Oxford, there are no remnants, only arrangements. The smell inside the chapel that day was faintly sour, the mingling of old incense and polished wood. The choir stalls were empty, their hymnals closed in pious repose. I moved toward the organ, the boards creaking beneath my weight. The glass sat just above the middle register, beside a folded piece of manuscript paper. I didn't touch it immediately. One learns to let silence reveal what haste conceals. There was lipstick on the rim, faint, rose-colored, almost ceremonial in its precision. The sort of mark made by someone who either didn't care they were leaving it or wanted to be remembered for having done so. The second possibility intrigued me more. Lewis stood near the pulpit, flipping through the choir schedule. He said something about the caretaker's statement about how the chapel had been locked at midnight, lights off, everything in order. I asked if everything in order included lipstick on sacramental glassware. He frowned, the question hanging between us like unspoken irony. I took out my handkerchief, held the glass up to the light. 2 sets of fingerprints, one faint, one clear. Male and female, if I had to guess. I told Lewis to have it sent for analysis. He asked whether I thought the woman was Rachel Denning. I didn't answer. Later, in the vestry, I examined the pipe organ more closely. One of the stops had been pulled halfway out a minor registration, rarely used. A strange choice for a choral rehearsal, unless one knew the instrument intimately. The faintest trace of varnish clung to the wood, the same substance found on Lascelles' broken spectacles. There was a window high above the organ loft, open just enough to let in a chill. The rain had come again, soft but insistent, drumming faintly on the roof. From that height, the view was almost pastoral. The cloister lawn below, damp with light, the ancient stones of the college wall beyond. For a moment, I tried to imagine Lascelles here on his final night. Alone, perhaps. Or not alone. The wine, the glass, the open window fragments of a ritual not meant for devotion. Lewis reappeared, his expression carefully neutral. He'd spoken with the bursar, he said. The man had been evasive, though not in the usual way. Not guilt or fear. Apparently, Lascelles had threatened to expose certain irregularities in the college accounts. I asked when that conversation took place. 2 days before his death, Lewis said. The bursar's alibi for that night was an airtight dinner engagement at Exeter. But airtight alibis have a habit of leaking if one listens closely. We left the chapel as the afternoon faded into that peculiar Oxford half-light gold turning to iron, rain turning to mist. I paused at the gate, watching a group of students hurry past, their laughter brief and directionless. I envied them in the way a man sometimes envies strangers for the absence of memory. Back at my flat, I poured a drink and turned over the day's pieces in my mind. The lipstick, the fingerprints, the varnish, the bursar's unease. Each detail fit somewhere, but the pattern refused to appear. My crossword lay open beside the glass. One clue read, "Musical confession left unfinished 6." The answer came slowly. Psalm. But when I penciled it in, it didn't fit the grid. A false clue, perhaps, or a missing letter, like Lascelles' final bar, left open, suspended, waiting for completion. Before bed, I returned once more to the photograph from 1974. The young faces stared back at me, frozen in harmony. Edward Reeve, Simone Calder, Adrian Lascelles. And behind them, in the corner of the frame, half in shadow, the bursar, younger, thinner, smiling too widely. It wasn't the expression that struck me, but what rested on the windowsill beside him. A half-empty glass of wine catching the same light as the one I'd found on the organ. Coincidence, perhaps. Or continuity, that strange Oxford gift for repetition. Some notes, I thought, are never silenced. They simply wait for the air to remember them. There are moments in every investigation when the truth appears to draw near, only to dissolve at the slightest touch. That morning was one of them. The college bell had struck 10 when Lewis told me that forensics had returned their report on the wine glass. The prints were consistent with Rachel Denning's, and a second set partial, smudged, belonged to Adrian Lascelles. No other trace. Neat symmetry, too neat. Lewis looked pleased, as though the case had begun to tidy itself. I almost envied him. He said Denning had been seen near the chapel that night, and that a porter had glimpsed her leaving shortly after midnight. I asked whether the porter was sober. He hesitated, which was answer enough. By noon, we were back at her lodgings, a narrow Georgian house on Holywell Street, the sort of place that collects silence like dust. She opened the door herself, eyes redrimmed but dry. She didn't seem surprised to see us. We told her about the fingerprints, about the glass, about the music manuscript found near the organ. She listened as though to a familiar story, one whose ending she had always known. Then, softly, she said that yes, she had been there that night. She had come to speak with Lascelles, to forgive him. He had apologized for her brother, for everything, and promised to leave Oxford for good. She had left him sitting at the organ, head bowed, the manuscript before him. Lewis, satisfied, closed his notebook with the solemnity of a man completing a duty. But I couldn't quite share his relief. Something in her tone lacked the friction of guilt. It was too smooth, too rehearsed, like a hymn sung a beat too slow. As we left, I lingered on her doorstep. A wind had risen along the street, stirring the papers on her desk visible through the half-open door. Among them, a letter, its top line unmistakable to the Dean of St. Simeon's. She had been corresponding with him. About what, I wondered? Forgiveness or blackmail? The inquest followed 2 days later. Formalities dressed as inquiry. The coroner read from his notes in a voice that sounded bored by its own conclusions. Death by misadventure. A fall. No further questions. I watched the faces of the college dignitaries in the front row, The dean impassive, the bursar solemn, the choir boys whispering like restless ghosts. Rachel sat near the back, head bowed. When the verdict was read, she did not move. That evening, back in my flat, the city lights trembling through rain, I opened the case file one last time. On paper, it was finished. The facts aligned the story completely. Yet completeness has never been the same as truth. I poured myself a whiskey and stared at the photograph again of Lascelles beside the choir in that long-ago summer. My eyes caught on the smallest thing, a ring on his right hand, plain, silver, slightly loose. It was absent from the morgue photos. The next morning I asked Lewis whether it had been logged. He checked, frowned, said no. Perhaps misplaced, perhaps stolen. He said it didn't matter now. I told him everything matters, just not in the way one expects. Later, alone in the chapel, I sat where Lascelles must have sat that final night. The rain outside was steady, a low percussion. I traced the keys of the organ with one hand and felt the faint stick of dried varnish. The sound that rose when I pressed a single note was thin, mournful, incomplete, a melody waiting for a second voice. Beneath the keyboard, half hidden by a loose board, something glinted. The missing ring. Inside, faint engraving to AL from SC. The initials meant little then, but the craftsmanship was delicate, expensive, a student's gift, perhaps, or a lover's. Lewis arrived just as I slipped the ring into an evidence bag. He asked if I thought the case was finally done. I said it was over, which was not the same thing. He nodded, half understanding. Outside, the rain eased into drizzle. That night I worked on a crossword puzzle at the pub. One clue read, "Appearance of truth that conceals deceit, 510. I smiled as I filled it in with a false resolution. Music, like investigation, can end on a deceptive cadence, one that promises closure while quietly avoiding it. I left the pub before the last call. Somewhere in the distance, the choir began rehearsing again, their voices rising like a benediction over a lie. I've often thought that truth does not arrive like revelation, but like a voice breaking mid-note, half-formed, uncertain whether to sing or fall silent. The confession came to me that way. Not in a station or an interview room, but in the hesitant cadence of a young man who could no longer bear the weight of a secret rehearsed too often. Simon Calder had vanished for 2 days before we found him. His landlady reported a note pinned to the door. Gone to clear my head. Lewis thought he'd fled. I thought otherwise. Guilt rarely runs far from its source. It prefers to circle back, like an echo that cannot rest. We found him in the chapel, sitting at the organ bench, hands folded in his lap. The air smelled of wax and rain-soaked stone. His face was pale, his eyes dry. When I asked whether he'd been there long, he said he had not left since Sunday. He'd been playing. I asked what. He said nothing anyone would want to hear. He began to talk, quietly, like someone tuning an instrument for the last time. Lascelles had been kind to him at first, encouraging, almost paternal. But there was pressure unseen, unspoken to return favors in loyalty, not affection. When the dean threatened to dismiss the choir master over his opposition to the bursar's embezzlement, Simon had been sent to reason with him. Lascelles, he said, had laughed, then wept, then promised to go public. The struggle, Simon claimed, was brief. A push, a fall, silence. Lewis asked where the body landed. Simon pointed down the stairwell, his gesture mechanical, as though guided by memory rather than conscience. He said he had panicked, fetched the dean, and together they had staged the scene, replaced glasses, arranged the hymn book, and poured the wine. The dean had promised to protect him, to make it all disappear. The lie had lasted precisely 6 days. I watched him as he spoke, the words flattening into the air between us. There was no drama, no plea for absolution, only a strange resignation, the kind I've seen in men who have already decided how their story ends. I asked if he believed what he did was murder. He said it was an accident. I told him accidents don't require rearranging hymnals. He looked at me then, really looked, and asked whether I'd ever done something unforgivable for someone I admired. I said admiration was often the most dangerous motive of all. Lewis, ever practical, began to take notes. I stopped him. Some things are not meant for the record. Simon continued speaking, but his words had lost their coherence. He spoke of the hymn Carmen Damnatorum, of Lascelles' obsession with the idea that the damned could still sing praise, that redemption and ruin shared the same melody. He said he heard that tune in his sleep, that it would not leave him. When he fell silent, I realized the chapel had grown darker. The rain outside was relentless, beating against the windows like unspent guilt. I told him we'd have to take him in, but he only nodded, almost gratefully. As we left, I glanced at the organ. A single note was still sounding faint, persistent. One of the pedals pressed down by accident or intent. The key was E. That night I sat at my desk, the confession written in Lewis's careful hand before me. Everything fit, and yet nothing satisfied. The dean's name was nowhere in the statement, though every line whispered it. I took out the crossword as a ritual more for company than diversion. One clue caught my eye. The singer who tells on himself 7. The answer, of course, was confessor, but I wrote choir boys. The letters fit just as neatly. Before sleep, I thought again of Simon Calder's face, the stillness of his voice. I wondered whether the truth had truly emerged, or whether, like so many of Oxford's confessions, it had merely chosen a more poetic disguise. Some chords, once struck, cannot be undone. They simply fade quietly, relentlessly into the memory of air. It was Lewis who found the way down. Beneath the chapel floor, past the vestry door and the narrow staircase that smelled of dust and disuse, a small iron gate opened into what had once been a crypt. The air was colder there, too still for breath, and the sound of our footsteps arrived only as a suggestion. A single bulb hung from a wire above the arch, casting a weak cone of yellow light over the stone. It was enough to see what had been hidden: boxes of old choir records, water-stained hymnals, a broken lectern, and behind them, a false panel of wood that didn't quite fit its frame. I touched the edge, pressed gently. It gave way with a sigh. Inside, wrapped in linen gone grey with time, was a leather folio, its clasp cracked and rusted. I opened it carefully. The first page was inscribed in a hand I already knew from the canticle for the departed. Lascelles' lost work. Lewis let out a quiet exhale, as though we'd stumbled upon a grave. I suppose, in a way, we had. The final bars of the composition were unmistakable, yet altered a motif of mirrored chords, a pattern I'd seen before in the 1974 records. But what held me was the dedication at the bottom, for Edward R. beneath it, smaller, almost hidden in the crease, and those who sang when they should have been silent. There are sentences that change the texture of a case. This was one. The music itself was peculiar notes arranged in a symmetry too deliberate to be purely aesthetic. 5 measures forward, then the same in reverse, a palindrome in sound. When played, I imagined, it would return endlessly to its beginning, trapped in its own echo, the damned singing without release. Lewis asked whether we should take it back to headquarters. I told him we would, but first I wanted to hear it. He frowned as though I'd suggested necromancy, yet helped me lift the folio to the organ upstairs. When I began to play, the chapel seemed to listen. The air itself tightened. The progression was haunting each chord, sliding uneasily into the next, the melody circling itself like a bird refusing to land. I could see why Lascelles had called it a canticle. It felt less like music and more like memory made audible. Somewhere between the second and third page, I realized that one of the bars had been altered. A single added note, barely noticeable, but enough to change the resolution from sorrow to defiance. Lewis, who had been standing by the aisle, said softly that someone was there. I looked up. The dean stood in the doorway, motionless, his expression the careful calm of a man who knows the play has reached its final act. He said we should not have gone down there, that the crypt was private property. I asked him whose college or his conscience's. He did not answer. Instead, he walked to the front pew, sat and folded his hands. He looked smaller than before, diminished somehow by the weight of the place. He said that everything he had done was to preserve the college, its reputation, and its harmony. That Lascelles had been intent on destroying it all with confession. I told him harmony built on silence was just another form of discord. When I placed the folio on the altar, he didn't move to stop me. He simply stared at it as if expecting it to speak. I think, in his way, he was relieved. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft as breath on stone. The choir would gather soon for evensong. I wondered what they would sing, and whether any of them would notice the new sheet of music placed quietly among their folders, Lascelles' canticle, unmarked, anonymous, but restored. As we left, I paused by the chapel door. The echo of the final chord still hung in the air, faint but unresolved. It seemed to me that Oxford was full of such sounds, prayers, confessions, lies, all of them waiting for someone to listen long enough to hear what they meant. That night, in my room, I wrote one final note in my report and closed the file. The crossword beside me offered a clue I couldn't ignore. Where voices linger though the singers are gone. 5. The answer arrived at once, almost tenderly crypt, and as the bells began their midnight chime, I thought again of the music that never ends, and of the souls who keep singing, long after the last light in the chapel has gone out. It ended, as these things so often do, not with revelation, but with quiet surrender. The dean's confession came the following morning, written in the same steady hand that had once inscribed sermons on duty and grace. There was no dramatics in it, no plea for pity, only a few unadorned sentences in admission of what had been done, and, more significantly, why. The preservation of the college, he wrote, had required a sacrifice of individual virtue for collective peace. Words as polished as the brass nameplate outside his study. Lewis read it aloud without inflection. He had not yet learned how guilt sounds when it believes itself righteous. I asked him what he made of it. He said it was clear enough that the dean had manipulated the boy, used his loyalty to silence Lascelles, then hidden behind the decorum of authority. I nodded, though clarity rarely comforts me. The dead, after all, cannot contest the living's conclusions. We returned to St. Simeon's that afternoon. The sky hung low, a grey lid over the spires, and the first chill of winter had settled into the air. The choir was rehearsing again a new piece, though even from the quadrangle I recognized the echo of an older theme. Lascelles' melody, resurrected. Someone had found the courage, or perhaps the need, to let it be heard. Inside, the dean's study stood untouched. On his desk, beside the unfinished confession, lay a small object wrapped in linen, the ring we had found in the crypt. I turned it over in my hand, reading the engraving again, to A.L. from S.C. There was something unbearably human about its simplicity. Love, ambition, guilt, all compressed into two initials and a circle of metal. Lewis said it should be logged as evidence. I slipped it back into the cloth and told him to leave it. Not everything belonged in the record. At the chapel, Rachel Denning waited near the front pew. She looked older than the week before, though perhaps that was only exhaustion. She asked whether justice had been done. I told her justice was an untidy thing, better suited to poetry than law. She smiled faintly and said she planned to finish her brother's story, the one no one wanted to read. As she turned to leave, I noticed the small silver crucifix she wore had been repaired and the crack in its center filled with resin. I wondered if she saw the irony. After she'd gone, I stood at the altar for a long while, watching the choir gather. Simon Calder's voice rose above the others, clear and fragile. I thought of him as I first saw him, nervous, uncertain, desperate to please, and felt the old ache of sympathy that borders on blame. He was serving a sentence that no cell could contain. The dean had spared him trial, but not memory. Lewis joined me in the aisle. He said it was over. I said perhaps. He asked if I'd ever believed in redemption. I told him I regretted that it lasted longer. He didn't answer. Instead, he handed me the day's crossword from the mail. The clue that caught my eye read, "Where the last note lingers longest. 5. I didn't have to think. The answer was heart. When the rehearsal ended, the choir dispersed, their laughter echoing faintly through the cloisters. I lingered until the final chords faded. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It carried residue, like perfume in an abandoned room. Perhaps that was all any of us left behind, the resonance of what we'd once been. That evening I filed my report. The language was perfunctory, stripped of the ache beneath it. Lewis read it through, then said it was a pity no one would know the music mattered. I told him they would. Someday Oxford remembers everything eventually, even its shame. Later, alone with a whiskey and the slow ticking of the clock, I thought of Lascelles' final composition, a palindrome of sound, beginning where it ended, ending where it began. The same could be said, I suppose, of most lives, mine included. Outside, the bells began their evening toll, soft and uneven. I raised my glass to the sound, to the city, to the ghosts who never quite left, and somewhere, faintly, I imagined that unfinished melody still circling, still unresolved, drifting upward through stone and air, until even the heavens forgot which part had been meant as the final verse. It was some weeks before I returned to St. Simeon's. The leaves along the high had begun to turn, each one a small act of surrender, and the air had that particular stillness Oxford wears between terms when the city, emptied of its students, becomes almost honest with itself. I told myself it was work that brought me back, some bureaucratic formality that required my signature. In truth, it was the music. The chapel doors were open that evening. Inside, candles flared weakly against the dusk, and the choir was rehearsing Lascelles' canticle for the departed for the first time since his death. The notes rose, uncertain at first, then steadier, like men learning to speak in a foreign tongue. The melody was familiar, yet not as I remembered it. Someone, perhaps the new organist, had rewritten the final bar. The piece now ended not on dissonance, but on a chord that suggested release without quite granting it. Hope deferred. Rachel Denning sat near the front pew. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable. When the final chord trembled into silence, she did not move, only pressed her handkerchief once to her mouth. I wanted to speak to her, to ask if finishing her brother's story had brought peace. But some questions diminish in the asking. I left her to her silence. Lewis arrived beside me halfway through the rehearsal. He still carried his usual air of decency, unspoiled by proximity to death. He said they were calling the performance a dedication, that the college had decided to let the matter rest. I said Oxford never rests, it merely folds its sins into ritual. He smiled faintly, unsure whether I meant it kindly. When the choir began again, I closed my eyes. The acoustics were perfect, merciless. Each note exposed its own frailty. I thought of Lascelles. of the Dean, of Simon Calder, their lives entwined in the same key, each trying to resolve a dissonance the other refused to hear. The more I listened, the more I felt the line between confession and absolution blur. Perhaps music was never about harmony at all. Perhaps it existed to remind us of the distance between what is felt and what can be said. Afterward, as the choristers filed out, I wandered to the crypt once more. It had been cleared now with no manuscripts, no relics of deceit. Only the faint scent of varnish lingered, that mixture of polish and decay unique to old sanctuaries. I found myself tracing the stone wall where the false panel had been. The cold seeped through my fingers, the way memory seeps into habit. Lewis called from above that he'd wait by the car. I told him I'd follow shortly. There, in that silence, I realized I could still hear it, not the choir, but something beneath it. The echo of that impossible chord, circling endlessly within the vaulted ceiling, refusing to die. I thought of a line from Donne that had haunted me once. No noise nor silence, but one equal music. Perhaps that was what Lascelles had meant to compose a hymn for the damned that did not ask forgiveness, only remembrance. Outside, the rain had begun again, steady and fine. The stones gleamed as if newly polished. I walked past the cloisters, past the porter's lodge, where the same man still nodded to me with cautious reverence. It occurred to me that in another decade, another inspector might come walking through the same gates, drawn by the same soft tragedies that thrive here. He would find new names, but the same arrangement of guilt. Oxford recycles its sins with admirable economy. Lewis drove in silence until we reached the roundabout by Headington Hill. Then, softly, he said it was strange how quiet endings felt. No triumph, no relief, just absence. I told him that was the nature of truth. It rarely announces itself. It simply stops being hidden. He nodded, and we said no more. Later that night, back in my flat, I poured a small whiskey and sat by the open window. The rain played a rhythm against the glass, syncopated, hesitant, unfinished. My crossword lay half-completed on the desk. One clue stared back at me. Song without end. 4. I hesitated, then wrote Amen. I left it there, uncrossed, unresolved. Outside, somewhere across the sleeping city, the bells of St. Simeon's began to toll. Not mournful, not triumphant, merely steady. A coda, perhaps, for those of us who listen too long and forgive too late.